Now, ladies and gentlemen, we start with our final keynote session of the day. This will be given by Nora Lustig, economist and professor at Tulane University, Martin Rapetti, Economic Development Program Director at CPEC, and they both will give the introduction to this session. Please welcome them to the stage.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here this late. It's an immense pleasure to be in charge of introducing Nora Lustig. Nora will give our last keynote speech. Nora Lustig is a Samuel Stone Professor of Latin American Economics and director of the Commitment to Equity Institute at the Tulane University. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and the Inter-American Dialogue. She is also a founding member and past president of LACEA, the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, and was a co-director of the World Bank World Development Report of 2000, which was the center of this report was on poverty. The focus was on poverty. Nora also serves on the G20 Eminent Persons Group on Global Financial Governance. And she has written and worked extensively on inequality and poverty in Latin America. I think we have the huge honor of having, in my own impression, the most prominent economist on these issues in Latin America. So for us, it's a huge privilege having you here. So we will do this way. Nora will give her speech, and we will have about 10 to 15 minutes to open questions with the floor. So Nora, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Okay, I feel a little bit like a Martian with this here. So let me start by, first of all, thanking Cari and CPEC, Julia, Jorge Mandelbaum, Jose Maria, Adalberto. It was so nice to see you again after so many years. And Martin, many thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. I don't know how many of you know that this is my hometown, so it's doubly an honor for me. I mentioned this because a lot of people know that I'm also Mexican, because my husband is Mexican, so I have 3 passports. But I feel obviously very, very attached to Argentina, and in particular to the city, in which I have so many friends, families, and colleagues. I am going to do something different from what I usually do, because I usually use PowerPoints and I walk. And this time I'm going to be sticking a little bit to a speech, kind of, so that my time is constrained. You tell me if I am able to do it. And what I want to talk about today is inequality and fiscal redistribution. And it's going to be a talk that will touch upon several issues, a bit like expanded bullet points, on which we can, if you want, expand later during the questions, or maybe in other occasions. I plan to come back, and hopefully we'll have other workshops on the subject. We have already been planning those with Martin. So one interesting thing about inequality is that now everybody talks about it. It's a concept that in the last 10 years has become gentrified. Before, people who talked about inequality were more sort of like in the margins. Jose Antonio, who's just been with us in the former panel, will remember that we belong to the group of economists who did talk about inequality when other people didn't. And why is it that it has changed? And I have my own theories. I am not an economic thought theoretician, but I think 2 phenomena happened which made this topic so hot. One is that the inequality, the increase in inequality happened in the US. Before, the US economists didn't focus on inequality because inequality was stable for decades. When it started increasing, you started to see that many of the brightest minds in the US began to look at it much more carefully. And I also think that the fact that the Cold War was over made inequality a safe subject. Before, it was a little complicated because you started talking about redistribution, even the redistribution of assets, and that smelled of socialism and even communism, so people didn't like to talk about that. And at that time, you could only speak about poverty, and inequality was usually a banned word in many places. And now it's sort of become a standard. In fact, you know, the IMF is constantly talking about inequality, the World Bank. But the IMF, that's a major, major change, because people who have interacted with the IMF in the past may remember that it was a taboo word to talk about inequality. Anything that had to do with inequality in the process of adjustment was considered off limits. If you asked anybody at the IMF in the 1990s about this, and even in the 2000s, it was considered to be, no, this is an internal political thing, so let's not discuss it. So why do we care about inequality? I mean, there are lots of us who care for ethical reasons, but beyond ethical reasons, there are instrumental reasons of why we want to be worried about inequality. Let me mention some. Higher inequality means that you're going to get less for the buck of growth in terms of poverty reduction. Also, higher inequality, especially in human capital, education, and health, can translate into lower potential in terms of productivity and growth. So that's another one. Higher inequality can also result in disaffection, violence, and social conflict. And also very high levels of inequality, especially high concentration at the top, create the phenomenon of elite capture of the state and the reproduction of policies that reproduce inequality over time. So bottom line, high inequality may be associated with lower social mobility, intergenerational one, lower growth, and lower social and political stability all around. So how unequal is our world today in the 21st century? I'm going to use the conventional measure that economists use a lot, which is the Gini Coefficient as the indicator of choice. And I think people are familiar with it, but if you're not, you just need to know that it goes from 0, which means maximum equality, to 1, which means maximum inequality. Around 2010, the Gini Coefficient, if you average for all those countries for which you have data, which are about 78, for which you have comparable data in the World Bank's database, it was 0.4. To give you an idea, the maximum was in South Africa, 0.63, the Gini, and the minimum was in Slovenia, 0.25. So in terms of regions, the advanced economies, Eastern Europe and the Central Asian economies, South Asia, had an average inequality below the global one. East Asia was pretty much the same as the global one, and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean had higher. And in fact, Latin America and the Caribbean has big time higher inequality. It's 12 points above the average. So that's where we are in terms of the situation. What has happened to inequality? We hear a lot that inequality is rising, is rising, is rising. That's not true, actually. If you look at the data in the 2000s, this database, again, that comes from the World Bank's World Development Indicators, that has maximum 78 countries. If you want to trace them over time, it has more countries, but they don't have 2 points in time for the entire period, shows that there's more countries in which inequality declined than in which it increased. Of these 78, there's 45 in which there was a decline, and 30 in which there was an increase. And in fact, Latin America and the Caribbean has a very special place in this because it's the region in which the decline was the largest. So bad, it's the highest inequality. Good is where inequality declined, and it declined in a non-significant way. From 0.55, that was the average Gini at the beginning, at the turn of the century, to around 0.5. And I will return later to sort of analyze which factors are explaining this change. As for the rest of the regional groups, there have been slight increases in average inequality in East Asia, small reductions in South Asia, and little change in the other regions. Also, the other regions have almost no data, like MENA has very bad data, Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa also has a very checkered database. And regarding the advanced countries, there's more countries in which you saw an increase in inequality and a few in which it fell. So the overall picture of the evolution of income inequality since 2000 is not that of a continuous and uniform rise in inequality. Inequality is higher today than it was at the turn of the century in a number of countries, but it has stabilized in many of them. There are also countries in which there was little change, and like I said, there's also countries in which the decline was very notable. An important caveat is in order. All these measures rely on household surveys. And household surveys have one main sin. They do not capture the rich. There is undercoverage and or underreporting of top incomes. So inequality may be understated, although the fact that the rich are there not always results in that when you add them, inequality goes up, but in general it goes up, and also may affect the trends. Maybe we're missing part of the story for not capturing the top in the income scale. And in fact, the work that Tony Atkinson started many years ago, together then with Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sáez and our countryman Facundo Alvaredo, back in the Paris School of Economics and UC Berkeley, have been doing this fantastic job of collecting data from especially tax returns and other administrative data like Social Security registries to analyze what happens at the top of the distribution, in particular the top 1%, the top 0.1, the top 0.01, and you can go on. And they find that in many countries, especially in the advanced countries, the share of the top 1% has been going up, especially pre-distribution. The market share of the top has been going up. In here, let me make a pitch that I always make, and this type of data is essential if we want to know what is happening to inequality in the world, and unfortunately, it's not available in general. So I think that one important recommendation to governments is that to make transparency much more prevalent in terms of what is happening with inequality and also who pays taxes, this type of data, anonymized, of course, and with all the protections that you need to protect identities, should be run-of-the-mill to make them available so we can know what really is happening to inequality. Thus far, it's only very few countries in which you can have it. And it's only, after Piketty came and did his round of celebrity when his book came out, he got some of the countries to give him more data. But it's not become a standard procedure, and it's very important. So now let's talk a little bit about inequality and the policy space. I think that, the way I like to think about it, I'm not going to go into lots of policies, there's no time. I'm going to focus on fiscal redistribution, but I think, one way that's nice to think about what type of realms policy needs to act upon are in three groups. One is the poor, in which what you want is to help them in terms of their living standard. The poor, the people who are vulnerable, those who are socially excluded, you need probably mainly safety nets in the short term and investment in their capacities, capabilities, so they can become more productive and have higher incomes in the future. The second set of policies would be to address the needs of the middle class. For that, you need to have policies of resilience, a lot of social insurance, where a lot may be financed by the middle class itself. It's intertemporal smoothing. And given the large and in many countries high concentration of income at the top, you want to have policies that curb that, in particular for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that you have the problem of elite capture if you allow the concentration to go unabated. So one of the key tools in all this space is fiscal redistribution. Through fiscal redistribution, you tax the rich, and you give safety nets to the poor. Through fiscal redistribution, you also generate the mechanism by which the middle class can have the social insurance programs. So that's a key instrument that has to be used for the policies that combat inequality. And fiscal redistribution can operate in two dimensions. One is directly. You tax the rich, give to people who are poorer, and that generates automatically a redistribution of income. But there's also a major way in which fiscal redistribution operates intertemporally, and it is through mass public education primarily, because that generates the possibility of people having higher opportunities for income generating and higher income generating opportunities in the future, and therefore you may change the dynamics of income distribution totally as you move forward. And we will see in a little while how that operated actually in the narrative of what happened in Latin America. Before I say that, I wanted to say something very interesting about the history of, can I take this off? Sorry, I feel like I am constrained here.
Can you turn
I don't need
that
this.
mic on?
Is that okay, no?
I think so.
Can
Can you turn that mic on? The one on the... Go ahead.
Sorry, yes, thank you. There's one book that I love and I always recommend by Peter Lindert. He's an economic historian in UC Davis, and he wrote a masterpiece, for me at least, called Growing Public, which is a history of the social state. He looks at 17, 18, 19, 20th century, particularly where he could find data. And what he found is really that things were very depressing, because before the 20th century, there was almost no redistribution. The states didn't spend any money on it. And worse, the more unequal the societies were, the less they spent on redistribution. So you had a reproduction of a social contract that reproduced inequality. Come the 20th century, there was a big change. And we have to understand what happened. That's it? 2 minutes? Okay, so then I have to rush. There was a big change, and there were three main forces: demography, development, and democracy. Redistribution became a normal thing. So let me move fast forward because I have 2 minutes, you said? All right. So what was the role of redistribution of the second kind in the context of Latin America, which resulted in this amazing decline? I say amazing because it happened in every country. It was not related to the commodity boom. It was not related to the fact that you had leftist governments. There were differences, maybe. Some were distributing more than others, but it was a common phenomenon. And really, the only thing that happened in every single country is that wage inequality declined. The ratio of wages from people with tertiary education to people with less than secondary declined. And so it was part of the process of educational expansions that occurred in the previous decades that made, if you want, people with higher education relatively abundant. And in using Tim Bergen's metaphor, what happened is that there's a race between education and technology. During the 2000s, the education side gained the upper hand. So that was one very important factor explaining the decline in inequality in Latin America. And I don't have time to go into it, but if you want, we can discuss during the questions and answers. So what's happening with fiscal redistribution today? We have data for now about 31 countries from the entire developing world, low-income countries and middle-income countries. And what we find is that every single fiscal system reduces inequality. Some reduce it by very little, almost zero. The highest one is 8 points for Gini, and the average is about 2 points for this group of countries, which is about a fourth of what happens in the European Union and the US. However, it's much more than the countries were doing, the advanced countries today were doing when they were as poor as the poor countries today. There has been, if you want, a ratcheting up in the redistributive vocation of countries, which is interesting because when the US was as poor as El Salvador today, it was spending much less on education and health than what El Salvador spends today. So there has been a ratcheting up in the commitment to generate redistributive policies. Inequality is reduced by fiscal policy, but we have one big problem. What we found in our research, and this is our main message, many fiscal systems increase poverty. So one thing is what happens to relative incomes, the other thing is what happens to absolute incomes. How come? Well, it's simple. I'm talking about the cash portion of the fiscal system. What happens, this is not a result of any diabolical plan that wants to impoverish the poor, but the poor consume, and there are consumption taxes. And so often what happens is the poor become net payers into the fiscal system. So this is a policy brief that I submitted to the T20 meeting, so you can look at it. I sort of bring as a conclusion of this result the importance of really being very careful about emphasizing too much the domestic resource mobilization agenda without a careful assessment of how you're going to implement it. It's one thing to concentrate on closing loopholes for the rich, reducing tax evasion, reducing subsidies to multinational corporations and the well-to-do in the countries, reducing waste and corruption, then implementing a VAT that taxes everybody, including basic goods. So as we move forward with the SDGs, with Sustainable Development Goals, we need to be aware that many of the things that we want to do will have trade-offs. You may not be able to provide the floors in all the benefits that you want to give people in education, health, and infrastructure if you want to pay that with resources that come from inside, especially in low-income countries. So we need to think about how we're going to create the resources and the opportunities for this, for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals without generating at the same time what I just said earlier, which is impoverishing the poor through fiscal systems that tax them more than what they get back. So let me stop here.
I guess, Nora, you'll have to stay there because otherwise your mic, or you have to put your mic again. Well, or no, use this one.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, so we have 7 minutes left, so we are open to 2 questions, I guess. Anyone wants to start? I think over there. It's hard to see.
My name is Andreas Freiter from Jena, Germany. I refer to your last argument that VAT is regressive. If you also think that poor countries use a lot of tariff revenues for mobilization of revenues, and also the highest tariffs are directed to food and clothing, so that adds to this problem. Is that right? Do I see it correctly?
We get another one? Anyone else? I'll make one for you. You talk about inequality, and I'm curious about intergenerational inequality. Here in Argentina, we have a fact that is shocking, that we have about 50% of childs being poor, and we have about 5% of the older than 60-something being poor. So what about that inequality and how to address it? Anyone else? No? Okay.
Okay. Yes, Andreas. I mean, obviously, I mentioned VAT, but you have, actually one of the worst, if you want, anti-poor taxes are the excise taxes as well. And what I'm saying is that this is a phenomenon that needs to be analyzed and see whether you can compensate the poor with enough transfers, or what can you do to the tax structure so they're not net payers. I think we need to try for the poor not to be made. I'm talking about people that live on $190 per day, mind you. I mean, I'm using the international poverty line, the extreme poverty line when I say that. And so if we care about the poor, I mean, it doesn't make sense to tax them more in the present, because even if they receive education and health, that's very important, but they're not edible, okay? So my point is that you need to have protection of the purchasing power. And in fact, I wanted to just say as an anecdote, we did a study for Ethiopia together with the World Bank and with the government of Ethiopia. The World Bank was interacting, and they found that, and they didn't like that because they were not realizing that their tax system was impoverishing the poor. And it was linked to not actually indirect taxes, it was direct taxes because of bracket creeping. With inflation, the threshold had become too low, so people were paying taxes at very low levels. And after the results, they were able to change that, and they increased also the safety net. So the thing is, we need to have a diagnostic and find ways in which we create the fiscal space in a way that is not anti-poor. That's my point. And by the way, even if they're not regressive, I'm always saying this, forgive me for having a teaching moment. For me, regressive is linked to inequality. So even if taxes are progressive, like they were in Ethiopia, direct taxes were progressive. They taxed relatively more the rich than the poor. But if they tax the poor, then they're anti-poor, which is different, okay? So your question about intergenerational inequality, I think that when we talk about poverty, I mean, you were talking about primarily on poverty, and your concern here is that because most of the incidence of poverty is much higher with children, you're actually damaging the prospects of the children to do better in the future, and I think that that is correct. But we need to look at it very carefully, because in some countries, the protection of the elderly actually results in benefits for the children because of family transfers. In South Africa, what they found is that even though the safety net was directed to a large extent to the grandmothers, if you want, the grandmothers supported the grandchildren. So there was an intra-family redistribution that actually ended up being pro-poor. No? But, so we can't generalize, but in principle, you want to make sure that if it doesn't happen from your state policies, then it happens within the family. If it doesn't happen within the family, then your state policy has to definitely invest in early childhood.
We have 2 more minutes. We have one question there, and Beatriz Nofal, and we close there. Here, please. Here.
Yes, you mentioned that in Latin America there have been success in reducing the inequality, correct? In which were, in your opinion, the 1 or 2 plans that were really effective by country, and which were the key ingredients for their success?
And Beatriz Nofal over there.
The question is regarding inequality in developed countries. The whole discussion about inequality in developed countries, or at least the most recent, is whether it's technology produced because of automation, or whether it's trade impact, mainly the China trade shock. My question, well, most of the literature, particularly professionally on labor market, talks about the dominance of the technology effect, although at the community level, maybe in some localities, the China trade effect. But very, very few people ever mention the impact of the financial crisis, since we are 10 years after Lehman. I mean, people were not only were left out of employment, they were left out of their houses. So I just wanted to know your opinion on that.
Yeah, let me start with that one. It's an opinion, it's a conjecture. I don't research that. So I always feel a little hesitant about answering. But I mean, the first question, whether it's skill bias or, it's labor saving, more than skill, labor saving, technological change versus globalization, like trade, migration, etc. I think that there's agreement that labor saving technical change is a phenomenon that is creating wage inequality in the US. And with respect to globalization, the evidence is mixed. There are cases in which there are negative effects, there are cases in which there are positive effects, so it's not something that you can sweepingly say it's always going to go in one direction or the other. With respect to what happened with the financial crisis, what I have read, I mean, and I think the OECD has been writing about this, is that inequality increased. But we have to remember that also for a period of time, you had a lot of wealth destruction. So probably if you measure what happened in 2011 or 2012, maybe it was not clear because you had a lot of wealth destruction through the stock market happening there. But now, with the boom, probably that was recovered. And mainly, I think people who lost their homes and were unemployed for long periods and were unable to re-enter the labor force, those are probably damaged. But I have not seen, sort of the final net effect of what what was the cost. Right now, the economy in the US, for example, is booming, so unemployment is very low and wages have started to increase, so we may see a reversal of that, not necessarily for the people who lost their houses. Your question. The interesting thing is that I don't think that the decline in inequality in Latin America happened by design in general, and that's what's fascinating. And I know, whenever you talk about declining inequality in Latin America, people look at you and they say, well, what do you mean? There's lots of inequality. Yeah, it's still the most unequal region in the world. So it's not that we are in nirvana, but it's interesting to see that for a while it went in the opposite direction. And I think that's why I was talking about the fact that you had education, the upgrading of education happening in all the countries. It had stopped during the 1980s debt crisis. It was sort of like slower educational upgrading, but then it picked up again. And that generated this sort of change in the composition of the labor force in favor of the lower skills. On top of that, in some countries, you had labor market policies that were pro-labor, like increases in minimum wages. This happened in Brazil, it happened in Argentina, pro-union. But inequality declined also in Mexico, where the minimum wage had been stagnant since 1991. And the unionization rate also had been stagnant since 1991. So in some cases, it was reinforcing. Where your question may have, if you want an intentionality attached, is in the large-scale cash transfer programs that were implemented in many countries. I think that's the most important technological change that happened in social policy in the 1990s, the discovery that you could redistribute cash on a large scale and to places that were very remote geographically, because before there was something that nobody could imagine, that in the Sierra de Puebla you would be able to give to the indigenous group the transfer by Progresa. And then it happened. So, these large-scale CCTs, in fact, they were invented in Latin America, I think were very important. If you look at the sort of if you decompose the change in inequality for the region and you take an average, you see that about between 50 and 60% of the decline is explained by the decline in the wage inequality associated to this phenomenon on education and reinforced by minimum wages in the countries where that happened, and other things, because it was also, like in Brazil, a reduction in discrimination, so inequality between races and gender declined as well. And about 20% is explained by more progressive transfers. The generosity of the transfers and the progressivity in this period was very important, and that's where the sort of the intentionality in helping reduce inequality and poverty can be seen.
We would like to stay longer, but we have to leave here. Nora, thank you so much for being here.
And again, it's a great pleasure. And let me end by congratulating Kari and Sipek, because you've been impeccable in having this successful meeting and in, I imagine, much more difficult circumstances that we envisioned when you started. Yes. So congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.